Now, moving on to the next and last story before I give a little update about the move.
Whoa, bitch, get out the way.
Protests broke out in the Russian Far East, calling for Putin to resign after popular governor Sergei Furgal was arrested for ties to multiple murders in the early 2000s. So let's get into this. Seems like a big deal.
I don't know how to put this, but I'm kind of a big deal.
Protests breaking out in the Russian Far East? Not common at all. Calling for Putin to resign? Kind of common, but not that common. A popular governor being arrested for ties to multiple murders. That's where the story's like, wow, okay, let's dig in, folks. So Sergei Furgal is a popular politician, like I said, from the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a minority party in Putin's Russia. I'll go more into the story about the actual arrests and murders, but I have to unpack super basic Russian politics for some context.
I've been asked to talk about Russia, and I might talk about Russia.
Political parties in Russia, as you could imagine, are different than in the US. All of Russia is predominantly controlled by Putin's party, United Russia. And then United Russia is part of this, it's called All Russia's People Front, which is like a political coalition that bolsters Putin and United Russia. Then there's a handful of marginal parties who actually do have some positions of power, but not much. So imagine United Russia, Putin's party, and the surrounding apparatus, All Russia's People's Front, are like the Republican Party in the United States. But instead of in the U.S., there's maybe 5% of Republicans or neo-Nazis, maybe 10%, I don't know. I'd guess 5 to 10% are just straight up neo-Nazis, neo-Confederates, stuff like that. So imagine if in Russia you take out the neo-Nazis, give them their own smaller parties. And then imagine so you take out the neo-Nazis, and then now imagine like 50% of the most centrist Democrats are also Republicans. That is United Russia. It's basically the Republican Party with a little bit of the neo-Nazis teased out, and then a bunch of Democrats added in. So, as you can imagine, it is a immensely huge party. It completely dominates every aspect of Russia. So then imagine, instead of the Democratic Party as a sort of opposition party to the Republicans, there was a dozen or so small parties from far left to far right. And to put it into perspective, All Russia's People Front has 340 seats out of 450 in the State Duma. So it's basically 340 for Putin's party, 110 split amongst a bunch of marginal parties. Okay, so now that I've got that out of the way, let me get back to Sergei Furgal being accused of aiding in murders. And that will come up again when I talk more about Sergei Furgal's party specifically, but let me talk about the murder case. Russia's top investigative agency claims that Sergei Furgal is considered, quote, the organizer of an attempted murder and the murder of a number of business people in 2004 and 2005. 4 members of the organized crime group Furgal is allegedly linked with were previously convicted for their roles in the murders committed in Khabarovsk and the neighboring Amur region. There were reportedly 15 entrepreneurs who were murdered that are connected to the same business crime syndicate. So obviously this was quite the operation going on. Sergei Furgal's supporters claim that he is a political prisoner. That's the main reason they're protesting. They claim the timing is too suspect and opportunistic. And personally, I think the allegations about his association with murder could be true. I don't know if they are. I don't know either way. But I also believe that even if the allegations are true, he was primarily arrested for political reasons. However, there are elements to the story I haven't talked about yet. I alluded to this a little earlier, but the first thing I want to point out is that Sergei Furgal's party, the Liberal Democratic Party, is a far-right party.
Are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
They support Russian ultranationalism. They want to renew the Russian Empire and turn it into a Eurasian empire. They are vocally and openly pro-imperialism. They want to seize territory previously claimed by Russia at different points in history. Not only that, but despite the Liberal Democratic Party's far-right positioning and their position as an opposition party, they still frequently support Putin and his party. Because of this, some people think they're secretly supported by the Kremlin. In other words, they're paid opposition. They're the Washington Generals. They get paid by Putin to lose and then support what he wants. Sergei Furgal is unique, however, because he seems to take the party line more seriously and rigidly than most. Which is why people are protesting his arrest so much, and also why he's presumed to be arrested for political reasons. Sergei Furgal kind of comes across as the type of guy who, let's say, Donald Trump goes out there and talks a bunch of crap about, choose your group, choose your marginalized group, Trump talks about him. And then, I imagine a bunch of Trump's fans go online and take everything Trump said seriously while he's sitting at home watching what's the Billy Bush show, Hollywood Tonight or whatever, and just he doesn't believe this shit. You took it seriously. He was just trying to sell you something. You bought in, but then you took it to a whole other level, dude. That's what I think about this Sergei Furgal guy.
What do you mean?
But the last thing I want to highlight about this story is how it was being covered in the failing New York Times.
The New York Times is not even, I barely read it.
What a shocker, the New York Times is covering a story in a manipulative and misleading way. I read 2 different stories about this in the New York Times, and I don't understand what the after I read the stories, I didn't understand what the Liberal Democratic Party stood for. I didn't know what Sergei Furgal stood for. I had to research all of that, okay? And the reason why the New York Times doesn't want to draw attention to the fact that Sergei Furgal is a far-right extremist.
I don't even believe this. This is what the Nazis believe.
The New York Times needs to publicize the story, and I don't mean need as in they're being forced. I'm saying to justify their ideological cause they need to. Because they need to justify American foreign policy goals. And current American foreign policy goals include delegitimizing and undermining the Putin administration.
Russia hates Russia, Putin, Russia.
But of course, the New York Times can't explain how or why Sergei Furgal and the Liberal Democratic Party is far right wing. They can't talk about that too much. I mean, they can a little bit, because most people won't notice if you only do a little bit, because being sympathetic to a far-right authoritarian party undermines the New York Times' attempt to undermine Russia as being authoritarian. In other words, the New York Times' goal is to make Russia look bad, because it advances U.S. foreign policy of aggression towards Russia. The way they are making Russia look bad is by painting them as authoritarian. So they can't also portray this opposition that they're bolstering as authoritarian, even though they're a lot more explicitly authoritarian. At least ideologically. They aren't, because they don't have power. Whoever has power actually has the ability to be authoritarian. But they advocate for a more authoritarian Russia.
Authoritarians who want to control us so that they can have us silenced.
So the first article is about Furgal's arrest. The second article is more about the protests. Both were written by a guy named Andrew Higgins. So the first article characterizes Furgal as, quote, a regional leader long viewed as disloyal, end quote. They then mention how he, quote, took office in 2018 after defeating a Kremlin-endorsed candidate, end quote. Both of these suggest, in the minds of American liberals, that Sergei Furgal is a resistance-type liberal.
Liberals need to stand up.
The way they're portraying him makes him look like the equivalent of an anti-Trump character, but in Russia, anti-Putin. To Russiagate poison losers who read the New York Times, no one can be more right-wing or authoritarian than Putin. So all they have to say is, this guy's a resistance hero, and they're just like, you know, flashing their boobs like it's freaking Woodstock 99. Like, they love this dude.
Now I know y'all be loving this shit right here. L-I-M-P, biscuit is right here.
And to be fair, the article does refer to Furgal and the Liberal Democratic Party as far right, but it's also conspicuously, later on in the article, after all the important details, and in the second article, which I'm about to read or reference, he doesn't mention that at all. He doesn't mention the party standing whatsoever. And this is the more important article because it's longer, has more details, and it's also about the protests. So here are a few quotes from the other New York Times articles to show how they portrayed this far-right figure. Quote, Mr. Furgal, a member of the Liberal Democratic Party of the nationalist rabble-rouser Vladimir Zhirinovsky, took office in 2018 after defeating a Kremlin-endorsed candidate, end quote. By the way, they used that Kremlin-endorsed candidate line twice. I'm not repeating anything. That's a go-to. So, I mean, New York Times vaguely refers to the party's right-wing position by calling it nationalist, and the party is nationalist. But nationalism can mean a lot of things, and New York Times is using that word to obfuscate a more accurate description, which would be, you know, far-right, ultra-nationalist, imperialists, anything like that. But those are no-no words for New York Times. Also, how they describe Zhirinovsky as a rabble-rouser, that's a huge understatement. Zhirinovsky has made many extremely repulsive comments. He especially has a tendency to threaten violent rape against women, as well as threatening to bomb or destroy other countries, particularly Poland, Ukraine, Turkey, and the Baltic states. So already they kind of made this guy seem, they're really banking that you see the word liberal Democrat and then you're like, yay, this guy's like anti-Trump but in Russia, yay! The Kremlin hates him and his boss is a rabble-rouser. That is so cool! That is what they want you to think when you read that. Okay, so continuing from the article, New York Times writes, quote, despite Sergei Furgal's affiliation with a party scorned by Russian liberals as a collection of crackpots and crooks, he has now been embraced by many Kremlin critics as a victim of political repression by Mr. Putin, end quote. So, for one, it's obviously reductive. Again, it's very obfuscating to refer to a far-right party as, quote, crackpots and crooks, because although that may certainly be true, most politicians are crooks.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
And it's a small point, but like them being crackpots and crooks, that's like a fifth thing you mentioned, eighth thing you mentioned, 10th. It's not that important. The more important thing is it's a far-right political party. Like calling a politician a crook, that's literally not saying anything. They're all freaking crooks. We know that. Grow up.
You're all bitches. Everybody's a bitch.
So it's just more obfuscation, and considering that the Liberal Democratic Party has a far-right orientation, it would actually be a bad thing if Russian liberals were rallying around him. They say it like it's a good thing, like, oh, this guy might be a crook, but now liberals love him. Well, liberals really shouldn't freaking like this guy. He sucks.
You suck!
Another thing that happens in both the articles is Andrew Higgins refers to political figures who are supposed to symbolize the left, but aren't actually left-wing figures. They're merely pro-American figures. Like, he'll be like, oh, the liberal left loves this guy. He's a symbol now. He's really beloved by the liberals. But, so, in the first article, he wrote, quote, Konstantin Kalichev, a political analyst who used to work for the ruling United Russia Party, said, Mr. Furgal's arrest so many years after his purported crime was, quote, an unequivocal signal, end quote, to all candidates in upcoming gubernatorial elections, end quote. What they don't mention is this Konstantin Kalichev guy that they're elevating to some like face of Russian liberals. This guy supported Putin at first because he assumed Putin would be a pro-Western neoliberal, but he left Putin when he realized that Putin wasn't interested in capitulating to Western demands. So this guy that New York Times is elevating is basically just Putin who wants to cooperate with the U.S., which, I mean, that is American foreign policy goals. They don't care who's in charge. It could be ISIS. That's why the U.S. enabled ISIS against Syria. As long as they'll cooperate with the U.S., they're the good guy. This guy, this Konstantin Kalichev joker, he's not a liberal, certainly not a leftist. He's a right-wing neoliberal who basically wants Putin but more friends with the United States. In the second article, when New York Times writes about Russian liberals embracing this dude, he really only means one liberal, and he's not even that liberal. So he writes, quote, Alexei A. Navalny, a Moscow-based anti-corruption campaigner and Russia's most prominent opposition leader, cheered Saturday's protests in the Far East, hailing the street demonstration as the, quote, biggest in the city's history. Mr. Navalny tweeted a video of the protests and a message of support. Far East, we are with you, end quote.
Baby, you know that I miss you. I wanna give
you.
What the New York Times doesn't tell you is that Alexei Navalny is the only evidence they have of liberal support, and the guy is by no means left-wing. He's literally a centrist, neoliberal technocrat who is pro-West. New York Times is propping him up, and consequently propping up a far-right political party that has his, indirect support, because their goals, all of their goals of undermining the current Russian administration align. All of this is to say, obviously I'm not defending Putin. Sergei Furgal may or may not have been involved with the murders, but either way, he still was probably arrested for politically motivated reasons. So I'm not defending Putin. My goal is to point out that the New York Times is indeed what they call fake news.
You are fake news.
But that narrative, the fake news narrative, is completely claimed by conservatives. Conservatives think New York Times is fake news because they have a centrist liberal slant and cover things exactly, and don't cover things exactly how Trump wants them covered. In reality, the reason New York Times is fake news,
you are fake news,
is because they have to justify American foreign policy positions. And if you're justifying American foreign policy positions, you will often have to obscure facts and frame issues in a completely backwards way. Not only that, the reason they have the illusion of being liberal is because conservatives don't need to be convinced of U.S. foreign policy. You could tell them you're bombing Timbuktu, and they'd be like, "Yay! Those people deserve it! Yay!" When they've never even heard of wherever you're talking about.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
Conservatives don't need to have their consent manufactured. Liberals do. Liberals have little twangs of guilt about the U.S. just being the most violent war machine in world history. They don't like to think about that. That's what the New York Times is for. Shh, it's okay, it's okay. We have the smart people in charge. They won't kill anyone too good. They're mostly killing bad people, don't worry. And it's all the people deserve it. Even if they might seem innocent, they actually kind of deserved it. So shh. Don't worry about American foreign policy. Those evil brown people won't hurt you. That's what the New York Times does.
That was undeniable proof that we totally owned you, lamers.
And this is not the first time the New York Times and other ideological state apparatuses have obfuscated the far-right nature of groups that oppose Russia. In 2015, the U.S. gave military support to the Azov Battalion, an anti-Russian neo-Nazi Ukrainian group. Later on in 2015, U.S. Congress voted to disallow funding and training to go to neo-Nazi groups. So they instead went to groups that work with the Azov Battalion but aren't as explicitly neo-Nazi. However, even this amendment was removed in 2016, and the Azov Battalion reported in 2017 they were still getting support from U.S. military.
White people are the devil.
But if you read the New York Times or any conventional mainstream American news, you would likely have no idea how intrinsically linked the U.S. State Department and military are to neo-Nazi groups internationally.
I cannot, on my daughter's birthday, believe that you would sit there and do